Nicki, I know our students feel this way, but why do you think speaking your mind has become so controversial?
Because people no longer are using their minds, their brains. So right now, just imagine we're not allowed to have a different opinion anymore. We're not allowed to think out loud anymore. We're not, this is not what the world used to feel like. And especially for the young people, I don't want them growing up in a world where they feel like that. They deserve for their voices to be heard. They have valid feelings and they're thinking.
You just watched Nicki Minaj, one of the most influential hip-hop artists of a generation, a woman who built an empire on the radical proposition that a black woman from Trinidad could spit bars about sexual autonomy and unapologetic ambition in a misogynistic industry, sit on stage at a Turning Point USA conference, and proclaim that people have stopped using their brains because they dare to push back against reactionary politics. And if you're not feeling your blood pressure spike, then you haven't been paying attention to what is happening right now in this catastrophic political moment where celebrity realignment is not just culture war theater, but a deliberate weaponization of fame in service of authoritarian consolidation of power. Nicki Minaj appeared on stage Sunday at Turning Point USA's America Fest, and what we witnessed was not some benign celebrity wandering into political waters, but a calculated performance that launders far-right ideology through the veneer of rebellious individualism. And this matters because when Minaj claims we're living in a world where you can't have a different opinion anymore, she's not describing reality but inverting it, weaponizing the language of oppression while standing shoulder to shoulder with the actual architects of censorship and control. Let's get something straight before we go any further, because this is where the discourse always gets muddied by people who want to pretend both sides are equally guilty of suppressing speech. Minaj said she was tired of being pushed around, and she said that speaking your mind with different ideas is controversial because people are no longer using their minds. This is the classic reactionary move, the one we've seen deployed with increasing sophistication over the last decade, as the right has perfected the art of appropriating the language of liberation while advancing policies of domination. And what makes this particularly galling is that Minaj is making these claims at the exact historical moment when, since Charlie Kirk's murder, the Trump administration has launched a blitzkrieg against Americans' free speech rights with scale and speed that jeopardize the United States' credibility as any kind of defender of expression. Yet here she is suggesting that somehow progressives are the ones doing the silencing, and you have to marvel at the sheer audacity of standing before a conservative audience that has spent years banning books, criminalizing protest, attacking trans existence, and legislating what teachers can say in classrooms while claiming that it's the left that won't let you speak your mind. The performance here is so layered it almost becomes a work of art in its own perversity, because Minaj drew cheers as she claimed, "I didn't notice, we don't even think about them, we're the cool kids. The other people, they're the ones who are disgruntled, but really they're just disgruntled with themselves." Minaj made it clear that there has been a total turnaround in her political thinking from her previous positions, and this is the bombshell that should make everyone sit up and recognize what's actually happening here, because this isn't about free speech at all. This is about cultural capture, about the right recognizing that they've lost the youth vote, lost the culture, lost the moral high ground on virtually every substantive policy question, and so they're pouring resources into peeling off high-profile figures who can provide cover for their increasingly extreme positions. In 2018, Minaj was one of several celebrities condemning Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy that split more than 5,000 children from their families, and described herself as an illegal immigrant, and expressed terror at what was happening to children. But now the rapper replied, "Well, I have the utmost respect and admiration for our president. He has, I don't know if he even knows this, but he's given so many people hope that there's a chance to beat the bad guys and to win, and to do it with your head held high and your integrity intact." Who are the bad guys in this formulation? Because I need you to really sit with that language for a moment and recognize the Manichaean worldview being constructed here, where Trump and his administration are positioned as the heroes fighting against unnamed bad guys, who are presumably the people advocating for trans rights, reproductive freedom, climate action, racial justice, economic equality, and the basic proposition that maybe we shouldn't let billionaires hollow out the social safety net while working people drown in medical debt. And this is the insidious genius of the reactionary project right now, which understands that if you can frame your politics as anti-establishment rebellion rather than what it actually is, which is the reassertion of traditional hierarchies of power, then you can attract people who think of themselves as iconoclasts and free thinkers when they're actually just useful idiots for a movement that seeks to dismantle the very protections that allow for genuine dissent. The spectacular irony here is suffocating because Minaj called conservative activists the cool kids while sitting for a conversation with Erica Kirk at the Turning Point USA conference in Phoenix, praising Trump administration and expressing disdain for the usurping of traditional gender roles. Now let's talk about what's actually happening with free speech in America right now, because this is where the rubber meets the road, and where Minaj's claims reveal themselves to be not just wrong, but inversions of material reality. A new Fire Nork poll finds 2 out of 3 Americans rate free speech as very important to their vote in 2024, topping other hot-button issues like healthcare, immigration, crime, and guns, which tells us that Americans across the spectrum care deeply about expression. But here's what the data actually shows about who's doing the suppressing. Among progressives, all deplatforming categories have been increasing, and event disruptions have reached record heights. But among conservatives, successful cancellations have increased slightly. However, event disruptions are negligible, and attempted cancellations have cratered. So yes, there are instances of progressive campus protesters shutting down speakers, and we can have a conversation about whether those tactics serve our movements. But let's be absolutely clear that this pales in comparison to the systematic legislative assault on speech that's coming from state houses and now the federal government. The White House is using the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk as a basis to go after left-wing groups and threaten crackdowns on certain types of rhetoric, with Vice President Vance urging the public to report anyone they saw celebrating Kirk's murder, and telling people to call their employers, which is literally cancel culture but now with the force of state power behind it. And this brings us to the obscene hypocrisy at the heart of this entire spectacle, because the same people who spent years crying about cancel culture and claiming that the left was too sensitive and that people should be able to say whatever they want without consequences have now fully embraced state-sanctioned punishment for speech they dislike. The Trump administration has seemingly taken up the mantle of stoking a new right-wing-driven cancel culture, and after years of ringing alarm bells about people losing their livelihoods over comments on social media, the administration is using this very tactic to punish its opponents. This administration's use of cancel culture is an affront to the First Amendment protections and represents a chilling abuse of power, yet here is Nicki Minaj on that same stage suggesting that it's progressives who won't let you speak. And you have to understand that this is gaslighting on an industrial scale. This is the manufacture of a persecution complex by people who literally control the levers of government power, and it works because it taps into a real frustration that people feel about the pace of social change and the ways that cultural norms around language have shifted. But it redirects that frustration away from the systems that actually constrain our lives and toward marginalized people fighting for recognition and dignity. The free speech argument has always been the refuge of people who want to say bigoted things without social consequences, and I need to be clear about what I mean by that, because this is not about criminalizing speech or government censorship in most cases. This is about whether your employer should fire you for going on racist rants, whether universities should provide platforms for speakers who advocate for stripping away people's civil rights, whether social media companies should allow the spread of violent conspiracy theories that lead to real-world harm. And progressives have generally said that yes, speech has consequences, that free speech means the government can't arrest you, but it doesn't mean you get to keep your job at Dairy Queen after you march with tiki torches, and conservatives have called this cancel culture and claimed it's destroying America. Kirk's death sparked a frenzy of firings across the nation over employees posting opinions critical of Kirk, which experts called another form of cancel culture. The primary concern was whether speech could continue to occur with respectful civic discourse, with one expert saying this was evident during Black Lives Matter in 2020, which prompted what he called a radicalized effect. But what they won't acknowledge is that the difference between progressive accountability culture and right-wing cancel culture is that progressives are generally trying to protect vulnerable populations from harm, while conservatives are trying to protect power from criticism. Minaj being openly transphobic, saying if you are born a boy, be a boy, there is nothing wrong with being a boy. How about that? And this is where the mask really comes off, because this isn't about free speech or thinking out loud, or any of the high-minded principles she's claiming to defend. This is about aligning herself with a political movement that is actively legislating trans people out of public existence, that is criminalizing gender-affirming care, that is forcing people to use bathrooms that don't match their gender identity, that is erasing the very possibility of trans life. and Minaj is providing cultural cover for this eliminationist project by framing it as just common sense, or traditional values, or protecting children, and Minaj criticized Newsom over his support for transgender healthcare for minors, which tells you everything you need to know about what kind of different opinions she thinks we should tolerate, because apparently we're supposed to accept as legitimate the position that trans kids shouldn't receive medical care, that their identities are up for debate, that their existence is somehow an imposition on everyone else. This is the violence of the both sides framing that dominates our discourse, because when Minaj says people can't have different opinions anymore, she's equating the social consequences that someone might face for advocating bigoted positions with the actual material violence that marginalized communities experience when those positions are enacted into law. She's pretending that being criticized on Twitter is equivalent to being denied healthcare, or being fired for being gay, or being stopped and frisked because of your race, and this false equivalence is the foundation of the entire reactionary project, because it allows people to position themselves as victims even as they advocate for policies that harm the most vulnerable members of society. The persecution complex is itself a form of power, because it exempts you from having to actually defend the substance of your positions, and instead lets you retreat into a narrative where you're just speaking truth, and everyone else is too sensitive or brainwashed or captured by ideology. And you can see this in the way on stage with Erica Kirk. Minaj said, "It's okay to change your mind," and Kirk thanked Minaj for being courageous, despite the backlash she is receiving from the entertainment industry, with Minaj responding, "I didn't notice, we don't even think about them." The framing of this as courageous is particularly nauseating, because courage would be standing up to power, speaking truth to those who have the ability to harm you, risking something real to advocate for people who have less than you do. But what Minaj is doing is the opposite. She's aligning herself with the most powerful political movement in the country. She's sitting on stage at the largest conservative conference with the explicit blessing and promotion of the Trump administration. The White House subsequently tweeted posts of Minaj's full-throated endorsement of the Trump administration, and positioning this as somehow brave or rebellious. And this is the con at the heart of right-wing populism, which presents itself as anti-establishment, while being fully funded and promoted by billionaires and state power, which claims to speak for ordinary people, while advancing policies that benefit the wealthy at everyone else's expense, which wraps itself in the language of freedom, while building a carceral state that punishes anyone who steps out of line. And we need to talk about the racial dynamics here, because they matter enormously, and they complicate any simple reading of what's happening. Nicki Minaj is a black woman who came up in an industry that tried to diminish her at every turn, and she fought her way to the top through undeniable talent and relentless self-promotion, and part of her brand has always been about not letting people tell her what to do or how to be, about claiming space and power in rooms that weren't designed for her. And I think there's a way in which that justified rebellion against constraint, that refusal to be diminished, can curdle into a kind of individualism that mistakes any pushback for oppression, that can't distinguish between legitimate critique and illegitimate attack. And the right is extraordinarily good at exploiting this by telling successful people from marginalized backgrounds that actually the real problem isn't structural racism or misogyny or economic exploitation, but rather political correctness or wokeness or cancel culture, that you're being held back not by systems of power but by other marginalized people asking for their slice of dignity and recognition. Minaj said recently in the media it's almost been like a push to, it's not just making young black children feel proud of themselves, but almost like doing that, and at the same time telling other children not to be proud of themselves, and elaborated, "I don't want what was done to little black girls done to little white girls. I don't want it done to any girls. I want all the little girls in the world to know that you are unique, you are beautiful, you are you, and you can compliment another girl." This is the zero-sum framing that undergirds so much reactionary politics, the idea that liberation for some means oppression for others, that if black girls are taught to be proud, then white girls must be taught to be ashamed, and this simply isn't how progressive politics works. This isn't what diversity and equity and inclusion are about. These are programs designed to remedy specific historical harms and create conditions where everyone can flourish, but the right has been incredibly effective at framing this as reverse discrimination or anti-white racism. And apparently Minaj has bought into this narrative hook, line, and sinker, and the tragedy is that she's using her platform to advance positions that will ultimately harm communities that look like her, that will dismantle the very protections and programs that made it possible for a girl from Trinidad to become one of the biggest stars in the world. The celebrity realignment we're witnessing is not accidental or organic. It's the result of a deliberate strategy by right-wing organizations that recognized they were losing the culture war and decided to pour resources into capturing influential voices, and Turning Point USA is at the vanguard of this effort. Kirk has stepped in as the chairwoman and CEO of Turning Point USA since the murder of her husband, late Turning Point USA CEO Charlie Kirk, in September, and the organization has been working to build bridges with figures outside the traditional conservative movement, and they understand that having someone like Nicki Minaj on stage is worth infinitely more than having another round of speeches from Republican politicians, because it signals to young people, to people of color, to anyone who might not see themselves in the traditional GOP, that there's space for them in this movement, that conservatism isn't just for old white men, but can include anyone who's willing to embrace their framework, and the framework is always the same: individual freedom over collective responsibility, traditional values over social progress, order over justice, and the freedom they're selling is always the freedom of the strong to dominate the weak, dressed up in the language of liberty. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it's happening at precisely the time when Americans have seen a notable degradation in the culture of free speech, especially online, and the desire to shut down speech isn't limited to one party or side, with cultural and political discourse overtaken by self-appointed censors who think that the best way to promote good speech is by stopping others from saying what they believe, and into this vacuum steps figures like Minaj, claiming to speak for the silenced while actually providing cover for the powerful, and the result is a discourse so thoroughly inverted that people can stand on stages before thousands and claim they're being censored, can appear on national television and complain they're being silenced, can have their statements amplified by the President of the United States and suggest they're being pushed around, and I need you to understand that this is not ignorance or confusion, but strategy. This is the deliberate construction of a persecution narrative that justifies any and all actions in response, because if you're fighting against totalitarianism, then anything becomes permissible, any alliance becomes acceptable, any compromise of principle becomes justified. The cancel culture discourse has always been about power and who gets to wield it, about whether marginalized communities can use their collective voice to push back against harm, or whether they have to just accept whatever powerful people want to say and do. And what we've seen over the last several years is that whenever oppressed groups organize to hold people accountable, that gets labeled as cancel culture and mob rule and the death of free speech. But when those same tactics are used by people in power to punish criticism, when the actual government starts going after people for their political views, when employers fire workers for expressing left-wing opinions, that gets framed as justified consequences or protecting values or maintaining standards. Conservatives are being asked if they've embraced the very cancel culture they once denounced, with the panic in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination springing from blurred distinctions, and after years of censoring speech, criminalizing politics, and transforming institutions into political monocultures, progressives have suddenly discovered the First Amendment, according to critics. But this inverts what's actually happening. Because progressives have always believed in robust speech protections, what we've argued is that speech has social consequences, and that marginalized people should be able to organize collectively to resist harm, but we've never advocated for the government to punish people for their political views. We've never suggested that the state should use its power to silence dissent, and that's precisely what the Trump administration is doing right now, with Minaj and others providing cultural legitimacy. The hollowness at the center of Minaj's claims becomes apparent when you actually examine what opinions she thinks are being suppressed, because it's never anything challenging to power. It's never critiques of capitalism or imperialism or white supremacy. It's always the right to misgender trans people, to spread medical misinformation, to advocate for policies that harm vulnerable communities, to say racist and sexist things without consequence, and framing these as principled defenses of free speech is like claiming that your right to swing your fist extends to someone else's face. It treats harm as opinion and violence as discourse, and what gets lost in all of this is any sense of collective responsibility or mutual obligation, any recognition that we live in a society with other people whose well-being should matter to us, any understanding that freedom means not just the absence of constraint, but the presence of conditions that allow everyone to flourish. The libertarian individualism that undergirds this worldview, the idea that you should be able to say whatever you want whenever you want without anyone pushing back, is fundamentally incompatible with building a just and equitable society, because justice requires that we grapple with how our words and actions affect others, that we take seriously the perspectives of people whose experiences differ from our own, that we recognize some speech causes real material harm, and that pointing this out is itself a form of speech that should be valued. And I want to come back to the substance of what Minaj actually said in that clip, because it's worth dissecting sentence by sentence. She says people no longer are using their minds, their brains, which is the classic move of suggesting that anyone who disagrees with you is not thinking clearly. Is captured by ideology, is incapable of reason, and this exempts you from having to actually engage with the substance of their arguments, because you've already dismissed them as mindless drones. She says we're not allowed to have a different opinion anymore, which simply isn't true. You're having your different opinion right now on national television, at the largest conservative conference in the country with the amplification of the president. What she means is that people are criticizing her opinions, and she doesn't like that. She says we're not allowed to think out loud anymore, which again conflates criticism with censorship, which treats pushback as prohibition. And she says this is not what the world used to feel like, which is revealing because the world used to feel like a place where certain people could say whatever they wanted without consequence, because the people they were harming had no platform to respond. And what's changed is not that speech is more restricted, but that more people have access to speech, that marginalized communities can now talk back, and people who are used to speaking without being challenged experience that as oppression, when it's actually just equality. The students Minaj claims to be worried about, the young people she says deserve to have their voices heard. Americans lack an understanding of the First Amendment, according to studies, while students have a greater acceptance of violence, which the Freedom Forum's Kevin Goldberg and Lukianoff agree are threats to the country's free speech culture. And this should concern everyone, because it suggests a broader breakdown in our capacity for democratic discourse. But the solution is not to pretend that all speech is equally valuable, or that we can't make distinctions between expression that contributes to our collective understanding and expression that causes harm. The solution is to model better discourse, to create spaces where genuine disagreement can happen without descending into violence or silencing, to teach people how to engage across difference in ways that are productive rather than destructive. And Minaj is doing the opposite by suggesting that any criticism is illegitimate, that anyone who pushes back is trying to silence you, that the real problem is people being too sensitive rather than people being cruel. I'm watching this and I'm thinking about all the actual threats to free speech that exist right now. The book bans sweeping through school libraries, the Don't Say Gay laws prohibiting teachers from acknowledging LGBTQ existence, the anti-CRT legislation preventing honest conversations about racism, the abortion gag rules silencing doctors, the criminalization of protest, the expansion of state surveillance, the attacks on journalists, the dismantling of public media, the consolidation of media ownership, the algorithmic suppression of dissent on corporate platforms, the use of slap suits to bankrupt critics, the revocation of security clearances as punishment for political speech. And here is Nicki Minaj at Turning Point USA, suggesting that the real problem is that people on the left won't let you share your opinions, and the dissonance is so extreme it would be funny if it weren't so dangerous, because this misdirection serves power by ensuring that people direct their anger at the wrong targets, that they fight each other instead of the systems that constrain all of our lives, that they mistake cultural shifts toward greater inclusivity for totalitarianism, while actual authoritarian policies get implemented with barely a peep of protest. This is how fascism has always worked, by appropriating the language of liberation and inverting it, by claiming that the real victims are the powerful, that the real oppressors are the oppressed, that the real censorship comes from below rather than above, and it works because it taps into genuine anxieties about social change and economic precarity, and directs those anxieties toward scapegoats rather than toward the systems that produce inequality. And what makes it effective in this iteration is the way it's being laundered through figures who themselves come from marginalized communities, who can claim authenticity and lived experience in ways that make it harder to dismiss, who provide cover for an agenda that is fundamentally about reasserting traditional hierarchies of race and gender and class and nation. And watching Minaj provide that cover, watching her use her platform to advance these narratives, watching her stand before that conservative audience and tell them they're the cool kids fighting against the bad guys, it's heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure, because she has the talent and the influence to do so much good, and instead she's choosing to align herself with people who would turn back the clock on every freedom that made her career possible. We're at a hinge point in history where the future of democratic discourse hangs in the balance, where we have to decide whether we're going to double down on our commitment to genuine pluralism and robust debate, or whether we're going to retreat into tribal camps, where the only speech that matters is speech that reinforces what we already believe, and figures like Minaj are making that choice harder by muddying the waters, by pretending that critique is censorship, and that accountability is authoritarianism, and what gets lost is any possibility of building a politics based on solidarity and mutual aid and collective liberation, any vision of a world where everyone has enough and no one has too much, where we treat each other with dignity and respect, not because we're forced to, but because we recognize our fundamental interdependence, where freedom means not just the right to speak, but the right to a life worth living, and that world is possible, but only if we're willing to fight for it, to name what's happening clearly, to reject the false frames and inverted narratives that serve power, to insist that speech matters, and consequences matter, and justice matters, and we can't have any of those things if we let people like Nicki Minaj stand on stages and claim victimhood while advancing the agenda of our oppressors.